A miracle of the Virgin Mary happened in the last place anyone expected, a chemistry laboratory in Boston. A professor who mocked one of his students for believing in the Virgin Mary would soon discover that there are forces in this universe no formula can calculate, and no heart can resist forever. But before we continue, leave a comment saying where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'd love to see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary are reaching. Professor Robert Chen was 48 years old and had spent more than 2 decades teaching chemistry in Boston. You know those professors who make an entire classroom sit up straighter the second they walk in? The kind who makes students double-check every note before asking a question. That was Robert. Precise, demanding, cold, not rude exactly, just distant, as if he had spent years carefully building a wall between himself and the rest of the world. Brick by brick, silence by silence. Robert's life operated like a laboratory clock. Wake up at 6. Black coffee. No sugar. Arrive at the university by 7:30, always the first person there. Teach flawless lectures. Grade papers late into the night. Microwave dinner. Sleep badly. Repeat. Every day identical to the one before it. Functional. Efficient. Empty. No student stayed after class to talk to him. No coworker invited him anywhere anymore. And Robert preferred it that way. Or at least he told himself he did. What nobody knew, what Robert never spoke about, was that Sunday morning 5 years earlier. His wife Catherine had been 42 years old, a literature teacher, warm where Robert was cold, bright where Robert was quiet. She laughed loudly in restaurants, sang terribly in the shower, made pancakes every Sunday morning while dancing barefoot in the kitchen. Catherine filled spaces with life. And somehow she had spent years trying to bring a little of that warmth into Robert's world too. That Sunday morning, she stood near the apartment door adjusting her coat before church. "Come with me today?" she asked softly. Robert sat on the couch with an academic journal open in his lap. "I have to finish this reading," he answered without looking up. "You always have to finish something." There wasn't anger in her voice anymore, only exhaustion, the kind that comes after hearing the same answer too many times. Robert finally looked up. "I'll go next time," he said. "I promise." Catherine stood there for a moment holding the door. That strange silence when someone wants to say something important, but decides not to. "I love you, Robert," she whispered. "Love you too." He looked back down at the article before she even closed the door. The phone call came 56 minutes later. "Mr. Chen, this is Boston Memorial Hospital. You need to come immediately. Your wife has been in a serious accident." Robert remembered every second afterward. The steering wheel trembling in his hands. Traffic lights that seemed endless. His chest hurting from how hard his heart pounded. The young doctor waiting for him at the hospital with practiced compassion written across his face. "We did everything we could, Mr. Chen." That sentence divided Robert's life into before and after. He remembered seeing Catherine one final time, holding her hand, feeling something inside himself crack permanently. Then came the funeral. Paperwork. Flowers. Condolences. People saying things they believed were comforting. "She's in a better place now. God had a plan. You need to keep your faith." Robert listened politely, shook hands, accepted hugs, thanked everyone. But underneath all of it, something cold began hardening inside him. A quiet anger. What kind of God lets a woman die 5 blocks away from the church she loved? What kind of plan was that? Catherine prayed constantly. She believed completely. And where was that God when a drunk driver ran the light? Robert stopped believing that day. Completely. 3 weeks later, he returned to work. People suggested more time off. Robert refused. Because work was easier. Work meant formulas, measurements, things that made sense. Work kept him away from the silence waiting inside his apartment. Away from the memories. Away from the promise of, next time, that would never happen. 5 years passed exactly like that. One empty routine after another. Until Tuesday morning in October. It should have been an ordinary class. Second-year chemistry students. 43 young people scribbling notes while Robert explained molecular reaction mechanisms across the whiteboard. The sharp smell of marker ink filled the lab. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. Robert spoke without emotion, writing equations in perfect straight lines. Then he heard it, a whisper from the third row. "But she prayed to the Virgin Mary and got completely better." The marker stopped moving instantly. Robert turned slowly toward the classroom. Silence spread through the room. That uncomfortable silence where everyone senses something bad is about to happen. Miss Rodriguez, Robert said calmly. Emma Rodriguez froze in her chair. Yes, Professor? Robert removed his glasses carefully, cleaned them slowly with the edge of his shirt, then put them back on. Since my lecture apparently isn't as interesting as your conversation, he said quietly, perhaps you'd like to share it with the entire class. Students immediately looked down at their desks. They knew that tone, and they knew what usually followed it. Emma's face turned bright red. I'm sorry, Professor. I was just... No, please, Robert interrupted. I'm genuinely curious. He leaned casually against the front desk. What exactly was so important? Emma swallowed hard. My aunt was very sick, she whispered. She prayed a novena to the Virgin Mary, and then she got better. Robert crossed his arms. That cold half-smile appeared. Interesting, he said softly. Then he began pacing slowly across the front of the room. So let me understand this correctly. His voice remained calm, controlled. Your aunt became ill. She prayed, then recovered. And you've concluded that prayer caused the recovery. Emma looked trapped. She believes it did. She believes, Robert repeated. Then he stopped walking. And the doctors? He asked. The medication? The treatment? The body's natural ability to heal itself? None of that matters. Emma's eyes filled with tears. I just know she was really sick, she whispered. And now she's okay. Of course she's okay, Robert answered sharply. Because sometimes people recover, Miss Rodriguez. That's biology, not divine intervention. The room felt suffocating now. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Robert said something he immediately should have stopped himself from saying. But he didn't. Because the anger was rising again. That old buried pain he never truly escaped. If prayer actually worked. He paused. The entire room stared at him. My wife would still be alive. The words landed heavily. Even Robert seemed surprised hearing them aloud. She prayed every single Sunday, he continued quietly. She believed completely. She was the kindest person I've ever known. His jaw tightened. And she still died. Emma was crying openly now. But Robert kept going. So forgive me if I don't share your enthusiasm for imaginary miracles. The silence afterward felt unbearable. Emma lowered her head, tears falling onto her notebook while the entire classroom sat frozen. And for the first time in years, Robert felt something worse than anger. He felt ashamed. Robert turned back toward the board and picked up the marker again. Now, if you don't mind, he said coldly, let's return to real science. But nobody was listening anymore. The classroom had changed. Students stared at their notebooks, at the floor, anywhere except at Professor Chen or Emma Rodriguez. The tension in the room felt suffocating. Robert continued the lecture mechanically, explaining equations and reactions to a room that had emotionally left him already. 40 minutes later, he dismissed the class. Students rushed out whispering quietly to one another. Some glanced back at Emma. Others looked at Robert with discomfort. Emma was the last person to leave. She paused near the doorway for a moment like she wanted to say something. But instead, she simply tightened her grip on her backpack and walked away silently. Robert remained alone in the laboratory. He erased the board slowly. Blue marker lines disappeared beneath the eraser one by one. And while he worked, he knew something. He had crossed a line. He had taken his pain and thrown it at someone innocent. But at that moment, he still couldn't bring himself to care enough to fix it. What Robert didn't know was that every word he had spoken had been heard. And that very night, his entire life was about to change. Because sometimes when someone challenges heaven publicly, heaven responds personally. 7 o'clock that evening, Robert unlocked his apartment door, and immediately the silence hit him again. 5 years later, and it still felt unbearable. That tiny moment after opening the door, when some part of him still expected to hear Catherine's voice saying, "Hi, love. How was your day?" And instead, nothing. He walked to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator. The yellow light revealed the same depressing contents as always. Frozen meals, leftovers, milk probably close to expiration. He stared at it for several seconds before closing the door again without taking anything. He wasn't hungry. Not really. He turned on the television just to create noise. But the cheerful voices of the hosts sounded distant and fake, like they belonged to another universe. He shut it off almost immediately. The silence returned heavier than before. Have you ever felt disconnected from your own life? Like you're watching yourself exist from behind thick glass? That was Robert every night for 5 years. Not living, just functioning. 8 o'clock. Robert sat on the couch staring blankly at the wall when he noticed a cup of coffee on the table in front of him, still steaming. He didn't even remember making it. Emma's face kept replaying in his mind. Her tears, the silence in the classroom, the cruelty in his own voice. What kind of man does that? He whispered into the empty apartment. No answer came. 9 o'clock arrived slowly. Robert sat now on the edge of his bed staring at the framed photograph beside the lamp. Catherine, laughing, always laughing in pictures. She had this way of finding light even on gray days. Robert picked up the photo carefully. I'm sorry, he whispered softly. You would have hated what I became. Then something changed. At first it was subtle, a warmth spreading through the room. Not heat from the radiator. Something different. Something alive. Robert slowly lifted his head. The room looked exactly the same. The same dim lamp. The same dresser. The same curtains. But the atmosphere felt different somehow. Heavier. Present. Then came the scent. Roses. Fresh roses. Strong enough to be undeniable. Robert's entire body stiffened. There were no flowers in the apartment. None. And yet the fragrance kept growing stronger. His heart began pounding. He stood slowly from the bed and looked around the room. Nothing had moved. Everything remained exactly where it belonged. But Robert suddenly knew with complete certainty. He was no longer alone. This is exhaustion, he said aloud weakly. You're tired. But even he didn't believe his own explanation. The scent intensified. Then suddenly, he saw her. Not gradually. Not like a shadow-forming shape. Instantly, a woman stood quietly near the corner of the room between the dresser and the window. A space Robert knew had been empty 1 second earlier. She wore a deep blue mantle. The kind of blue that exists in the sky moments before sunset disappears completely. Underneath it flowed a white dress glowing softly in the dim room. But it wasn't the clothing that shattered Robert. It was her face, and especially her eyes. Deep brown, filled with compassion so overwhelming that Robert felt every hidden wound inside himself being seen completely. Every moment of grief, every lonely night, every regret, every ounce of pain. Seen, understood, loved. It was the gaze of a mother who understood suffering. The gaze of someone who had watched her own son die. Robert tried to speak. No sound came out. He tried to move. Couldn't. Not because of fear. This was something beyond fear. Recognition. As though a forgotten part of his soul had suddenly awakened after years buried beneath anger. She stepped toward him silently, then spoke. Robert, my dear son. Her voice felt gentle enough to calm storms. You never lost your faith. You only buried it beneath your pain because it hurt too much to feel. Tears instantly filled Robert's eyes. You must forgive yourself. And you are not alone. Something inside him finally broke completely. Robert collapsed to his knees on the floor, and 5 years of buried grief exploded out of him. He sobbed violently, uncontrollably, not quiet tears, real grief, the kind that tears through a person completely. He cried for Catherine, for that Sunday morning, for every next time that never came, for every lonely dinner, every empty night, every wall he built around himself. He cried for Emma, for mocking someone else's faith because his own heart had died. He cried for everything. And then he felt it, a hand resting gently on his shoulder. Warm, real, comforting. When Robert finally managed to lift his head again, she was gone. The room looked normal, silent, ordinary. But Robert knew something impossible had happened there. He knew it with absolute certainty. He remained kneeling on the floor for what felt like forever, face wet with tears, chest aching. But different now. Not the sharp ache of grief. The ache of something broken beginning to heal. Eventually, Robert stood slowly and sat back on the bed. He looked again at Catherine's photograph, and for the first time in 5 years, he didn't feel only pain when he looked at her. He felt gratitude. Gratitude for loving her, for being loved by her, for having shared a life with her at all. She came, he whispered shakily. The Virgin Mary came. Robert never slept that night. How could he? He sat awake until dawn trying to understand what had happened. Part of his mind searched desperately for logical explanations. Stress, exhaustion, hallucination. But deeper down, he already knew the truth. At 7:15 that morning he showered quickly. The hot water ran down his back, while one thought repeated endlessly in his mind. Emma. He needed to apologize. Not a formal apology. Not a professional apology. A real one. By 8 o'clock Robert was already on campus. Far too early for his first lecture. But he couldn't stay inside that apartment another minute. Not after what had happened there the night before. The apartment suddenly felt too small for Robert. Too quiet. Too full of thoughts he could no longer ignore. 9 o'clock. Office hours. Usually nobody came. Students avoided Robert Chen unless absolutely necessary. But at 9:05 there was a knock on the door. Professor Chen? Robert looked up from the papers he had been pretending to read. Jessica, one of the students from yesterday's class. Come in, he said quietly. Jessica stepped inside carefully, but stayed close to the doorway, like she might leave at any second. Robert recognized that posture immediately. Students always acted cautiously around him. I wanted to talk about Emma, Jessica said softly. Robert's chest tightened instantly. I know, he replied. I need to talk to her too. He leaned forward slightly. Is she coming today? Jessica hesitated. I don't know. Something inside Robert sank. She was thinking about dropping the class. The words hit harder than he expected. Because of me? Jessica didn't answer directly. But she didn't need to. Emma went through a lot last year. Jessica explained carefully. She lost her younger brother. Robert froze. And while all that was happening, her aunt was really sick too. Jessica lowered her eyes. When her aunt recovered, it felt like the only good thing their family had left. Silence filled the office. And when you said those things yesterday, she stopped there. Didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Robert closed his eyes briefly. Shame settled heavily in his stomach. I didn't know, he whispered. I know you didn't, Jessica answered gently. But it still hurt her. Robert nodded slowly. Then after a moment, he looked up again. If you see her, could you ask her to come talk to me? Jessica studied him carefully. During office hours. After class. Anytime she wants. Another small pause. I need to apologize properly. Jessica nodded. I'll tell her. Thank you, Robert said quietly. Then after another silence. And Jessica, thank you for coming here. She gave a small nod and left. Robert stared at the empty doorway for a very long time afterward. 10 o'clock. Class began. Emma's seat in the third row sat empty. Robert noticed it immediately. And somehow that empty chair distracted him more than 43 students staring directly at him ever could. He taught mechanically, explained reaction formulas, answered questions, wrote equations. But mentally, he was somewhere else entirely. 11 o'clock. Class ended. Robert returned to his office and waited. 11:30. Nothing. Noon. Still nothing. 12:15. A knock. Robert's head snapped upward instantly. Professor Chen? Emma. Robert stood so quickly he knocked a pen onto the floor. Emma, he said breathlessly. Thank you for coming. Please sit. She entered slowly, carefully, and sat across from his desk with her backpack still clutched tightly against her chest like armor. Robert took a deep breath. Emma, I owe you an apology. His voice sounded different now. Softer. Human. What I did yesterday was cruel, he continued. And completely unfair. Emma looked down silently. I took my pain out on you. Robert swallowed hard. And none of it had anything to do with you. Silence. Heavy but not hostile. Jessica told me about your brother, Robert said carefully. Emma's eyes lifted slightly. And I think, maybe I understand more than you realize. Robert paused, then finally said the words he almost never spoke aloud. My wife died 5 years ago. Emma looked up fully now. She was on her way to church. Robert continued quietly. There was a car accident. His throat tightened. And after that, I became angry at everything. At God. At faith. At people who still believed. At anyone who still had hope. Robert looked directly at Emma. But none of that gave me the right to humiliate you. A long silence settled between them. Then Emma finally spoke. My brother was 8, she whispered. Robert listened carefully. The doctors said he had more time. Her voice trembled slightly now. But he didn't. Emma wiped quickly at her eyes. And yes, we prayed every single day. The whole family did. But he still died. Robert felt his chest ache hearing the words. Afterward, Emma continued. I got angry too. What's the point of praying if it changes nothing? What's the point of faith? Another silence. Then she looked down at her hands. But eventually, believing he's okay now. Believing I'll see him again someday. That helped me survive it. Emma gave a weak shrug. Maybe it's just a way to cope. Robert shook his head immediately. No, he said softly. It's brave. Emma looked at him, surprised. It's brave choosing hope when anger would be easier. The room went quiet again. But differently this time. Warm, gentle. Finally, Emma smiled faintly. The first real smile since entering the office. I accept your apology, Professor. Robert exhaled slowly like he had been holding his breath all morning. And thank you, Emma added quietly, for telling me about your wife. That must have been hard. Robert nodded. It was. Emma stood slowly and adjusted her backpack. I'll be back in class tomorrow. Robert smiled slightly. I'm glad. She walked toward the door. Then Robert stopped her softly. Emma. She turned. Thank you for giving me a second chance. Emma nodded once, then left. Robert sat alone in the office after she was gone. But for the first time in years, the loneliness didn't feel absolute anymore. Because underneath everything else, there was something new growing quietly inside him. Hope. That night Robert did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He opened the bedside drawer. Inside, wrapped carefully in an old handkerchief, lay Catherine's rosary. Dark wooden beads. Simple metal crucifix. She used to pray with it every single night before bed. Robert picked it up carefully. The beads felt smooth from years of use. Worn by Catherine's hands. He sat quietly on the edge of the bed and realized something. He didn't really remember how to pray anymore. The formal words were blurry, distant. So instead, he spoke honestly. I don't know if you're listening, he whispered. I don't know how any of this works. His eyes filled slowly with tears. But, thank you. He paused. For last night. For not giving up on me. Even after I gave up on everything. Robert held the rosary tightly between both hands. And for several minutes, he simply sat there crying quietly in the dim light beside Catherine's photograph. Finally, he placed the rosary gently beside the frame. Then lay down. And that night, for the first time in 5 years, Robert slept peacefully. No nightmares. No waking suddenly at 3 in the morning with his chest tight. No crushing emptiness. Only peace. Because sometimes a miracle is not the impossible becoming possible. Sometimes the greatest miracle is a closed heart opening again. Hope returning where only despair existed. Faith being reborn inside someone who believed it had died forever. Robert Chen may have been the least likely person imaginable to receive a heavenly visitation. A bitter skeptic. A wounded man. A professor who mocked belief itself. But maybe that was exactly why she came to him. Because if the Virgin Mary could reach someone like Robert, then there is hope for anyone. Maybe even for you. And if you made it this far to the end of Robert and Emma's story, write forgiveness in the comments. Because sometimes the hardest person to forgive is ourselves. And every time I see that word, I'll know one more person still believes miracles can happen even inside broken hearts. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. And if someone in your life needs hope right now, share this video with them today. May the Virgin Mary continue blessing and protecting you and your family. Amen.